What happens when judgment and prejudice collide with unimaginable, hidden power? In the sterile, anonymous world of an airport terminal, a world of fleeting connections and strict rules, a single moment of contempt can unravel a life's work. This isn't a story about a simple disagreement over a seat assignment. It's about a woman in a simple sweater holding a ticket that represented her father's entire legacy, and another woman whose laughter in the face of that legacy would echo into a deafening silence. We're about to board a flight where the true cost of disrespect is calculated not in air miles, but in shattered careers, and the humbling realignment of power at 30,000 feet. Stay with me as we uncover how one dismissive laugh set off a chain reaction that would rock an entire airline to its very foundations. The fluorescent lights of John F. Kennedy International Airport's Terminal 4 hummed with a familiar impartial drone, casting a sterile glow on the river of humanity flowing through its corridors. It was a place of orchestrated chaos, of tearful goodbyes and eager hellos, a nexus of 1,000 different stories converging for a brief shared moment before diverging once more across continents and oceans. Within this river sat a woman who appeared to be just another traveler, a solitary island of calm in the bustling current. Dr. Evelyn Reed was dressed in a way that defied easy categorization, a style she had perfected over years of needing to be unseen. A simple pair of dark grey trousers, comfortable loafers, and a charcoal-colored cashmere sweater that, while expensive, was devoid of any ostentatious logos. Her hair was pulled back into a simple, elegant twist at the nape of her neck, and her only jewelry was a thin, unadorned platinum band on her right hand, a gift from her late father. On the floor beside her chair rested a well-worn leather satchel that had accompanied her on countless journeys just like this one. She was observing. It was her primary purpose for being here, squeezed into an uncomfortable gate-side chair, waiting for Stellair Airlines Flight 110 to London Heathrow. For the past 6 months, since she had reluctantly taken her seat as the majority shareholder and chairperson of the board for Stellair's parent conglomerate, she had been inundated with data. She had seen profit and loss statements, customer satisfaction metrics that were polished to a deceptive sheen, and operational efficiency reports that spoke in a language of cold, hard numbers. But numbers, as her father, Richard Reed, always said, had no soul. They couldn't tell you the feel of the seat fabric, the sincerity of a crew member's smile, or the subtle undercurrent of tension that could curdle a passenger's experience before the plane ever left the ground. Her father had built Stellair Airlines from 2 propeller planes and a mountain of debt into a global aviation giant. He knew every bolt, every rivet, every gate agent in his first 5 hubs by name. He believed an airline wasn't a fleet of machines. It was a promise of safety, of comfort, and most importantly of dignity. He treated his janitorial staff with the same respect he afforded his board members, and he expected the same from every single employee who wore the silver starburst logo of Stellair. Evelyn, a PhD in organizational psychology, had initially resisted entering the family business, preferring the structured world of academia. But with her father's passing, the responsibility, the weight of his name and his life's work had settled squarely on her shoulders, and the reports she was seeing didn't align with the stories she was hearing through back channels. Whispers of declining morale, of a growing divide between management and crew, and of a corporate culture that was beginning to prioritize cost-cutting over the passenger experience her father had championed. So she had booked this flight, under her mother's maiden name, in a standard economy seat, with no frills and no special requests. She wanted to see Stellair not as its owner, but as its customer. She wanted to feel the promise. Her attention was drawn to the boarding podium where the flight crew was assembling. 2 gate agents, a man and a woman, were finalizing paperwork. Then the cabin crew arrived, a pristine unit in their navy blue uniforms. Leading them was a flight attendant with sharp, angular features and blonde hair pulled back into a severe bun. Her name tag read Karen. There was an air of brittle authority about her, a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her cold, assessing eyes. Evelyn watched as Karen spoke to one of the gate agents, her voice a low but sharp murmur. She gestured dismissively toward the crowded seating area, a faint curl of contempt on her lips. It was a micro-expression, fleeting and barely perceptible, but to a trained observer like Evelyn, it spoke volumes. The gate agent, a kind-faced man in his late 50s named Robert Peterson, simply nodded his own expression, professionally neutral. Evelyn had a faint memory of him. He was a veteran, someone who had been with the company since her father's time. He still embodied that old-school professionalism. An announcement crackled to life, signaling the start of the pre-boarding process for families and passengers requiring assistance. Evelyn watched Karen's interactions. She saw the forced smile offered to a young couple struggling with a stroller and a crying baby. She saw the clipped, impatient tone used with an elderly man who asked a question about his connecting flight. Karen Fletcher was performing a role, but the performance was thin, and the resentment underneath was palpable. It was the resentment of someone who felt their job was a chore and the customers an inconvenience. Evelyn felt a familiar pang of disappointment. This was what the data couldn't capture. The subtle corrosion of morale, the slow poisoning of the well of company culture. Her father's airline was not just a collection of assets on a balance sheet. It was a living entity, and she could feel a sickness beginning to take hold in its heart. She took a small, leather-bound notebook from her satchel and made a few discreet notes. The time, the gate number, the flight attendant's name. The call for Zone 3. Boarding her zone echoed through the terminal. Evelyn stood, slipping the notebook back into her bag and joining the queue. She clutched her simple paper boarding pass, a flimsy document that was in a way the key to her father's kingdom. As she moved forward, she found herself directly behind a young black family. The father was holding his son's hand, patiently explaining what would happen next, while the mother bounced a fretful infant on her hip. When they reached the podium, Karen was the one scanning the tickets. She took the family's boarding passes with a sigh that was just a little too loud. "Make sure all of your carry-ons fit in the sizer," she said, not looking at them, but at a point over their shoulder. "We don't have time to be checking bags at the gate." The father, unperturbed, simply smiled. "They're all regulation size. We fly with you all the time." Karen's response was a non-committal hum as she handed back their passes. Her gaze then fell on Evelyn, who stepped forward and offered her own ticket. Karen took it, her fingers brushing Evelyn's. Her eyes flickered from the paper to Evelyn's face, then back again. A slow, condescending smirk spread across her lips. And then she laughed. It wasn't a loud, booming laugh, but a short, sharp, derisive huff of air, a sound that dripped with mockery. She turned to her colleague, another flight attendant standing beside her, and tilted her head toward Evelyn, still holding the boarding pass like it was a curiosity. "Can you believe it?" Karen whispered, just loud enough for Evelyn to hear clearly. "Some people will do anything to get an upgrade." Dr. Evelyn Reed, doctor of what basket weaving? The other flight attendant gave a nervous titter, avoiding eye contact with Evelyn. The world seemed to slow down. The hum of the terminal faded into a dull roar in Evelyn's ears. It wasn't just the snide comment or the unprofessionalism. It was the casual, dismissive cruelty. It was the assumption that a black woman in a simple sweater couldn't possibly be a doctor, that her name and title on a ticket must be some kind of pathetic ploy. Evelyn's face remained a placid mask, but inside a cold, hard resolve began to crystallize. This was it. This was the soul of the problem she had come to find. Her father's promise was not just being broken, it was being laughed at. And Evelyn Reed was not the kind of woman who would let that stand. She met Karen's mocking gaze, her own eyes steady and unblinking, and held out her hand for her ticket. The battle for the soul of Stellaire Airlines had just begun, not in a boardroom, but right here at the gate of Flight 110. The moment stretched taut and silent, a pocket of stillness in the chaotic flow of boarding passengers. Karen Fletcher held onto the boarding pass, just a second too long, her smirk unwavering. To her, Evelyn was just another face in the crowd, a powerless passenger upon whom she could exert her small measure of authority. In her years of service, she had seen all types, the demanding, the meek, the fraudulent. She had become an expert in her own mind at categorizing people in a single glance, and her assessment of Evelyn Reed was simple, insignificant. The doctor honorific on the cheap economy ticket was to her a laughable affectation. Evelyn's hand remained outstretched, her posture unchanged. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand an apology. She simply waited her calm presence, a stark contrast to Karen's active disdain. This quiet refusal to be dismissed seemed to irritate the flight attendant more than any outburst would have. "Your boarding pass, please." "Evelyn," said her voice low and even, yet carrying a resonance that cut through the surrounding noise. With a final theatrical roll of her eyes, Karen slapped the paper into Evelyn's hand. "Enjoy your flight, Doctor," she said, the title now laced with a thick, syrupy sarcasm. "Seat 34B. Don't get lost." Evelyn took the pass without a word, her gaze briefly flickering to the other flight attendant, who was now looking pointedly at her shoes, a faint blush of shame coloring her cheeks. Then Evelyn looked past Karen to the gate agent, Robert Peterson. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. In his, she saw a flicker of recognition, quickly masked by professional decorum, but also a deep, profound alarm. He had seen the entire exchange. He knew who she was. The slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head was a silent apology, a plea for her to let it go for now. Evelyn gave him a tiny, reassuring nod. The reckoning would come, but it would be on her terms and at a time of her choosing. She turned and walked down the jet bridge, the muffled sounds of the terminal giving way to the gentle hum of the aircraft's auxiliary power unit. The sterile, recycled air of the cabin greeted her. She found her way to her seat, a middle seat in the back third of the plane, as she had specifically booked. It was the epicenter of the standard passenger experience, wedged between a young student engrossed in his headphones and a burly construction worker who already seemed to be asleep. As she settled in, she saw Karen Fletcher moving down the aisle, her movements sharp and efficient as she directed passengers and slammed overhead bins shut with unnecessary force. She was a whirlwind of practiced, impatient energy. Evelyn remained a quiet observer, her mind a whirring calculus of observations and consequences. The insult at the gate was not a personal wound to her ego. She had faced far worse in her life in academia and beyond. It was a symptom of a deep-seated disease within the company culture. A culture that not only allowed such behavior, but through inaction and poor leadership, likely encouraged it. A culture where an employee felt empowered to to mock a customer based on race and perceived social standing. It was a direct violation of every principle her father had instilled in the airline. The safety briefing began with Karen's voice, now smooth and professional for the recording, echoing through the cabin. The hypocrisy was jarring. She could speak the words of safety and customer care, but she couldn't embody their spirit. Evelyn leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes. She wasn't just a passenger on a flight. She was a diagnostician examining a patient. And this patient, her father's legacy, was sicker than she had imagined. The laughter at the gate wasn't just a spark. It was the flare of a gas leak, signaling a much larger, more explosive problem lurking beneath the surface. From his post at the gate, Robert Peterson watched the jet bridge retract. His heart was pounding. He had been with Stellaire for 35 years. He remembered Richard Reed not as a distant CEO, but as the man who came through the terminals at Christmas, shaking every employee's hand and asking about their families. He remembered a young Evelyn, a quiet, brilliant girl with her father's eyes, who would sometimes sit in the operations room, utterly fascinated by the ballet of arrivals and departures. He had recognized her the moment she joined the queue. The simple clothes couldn't hide the quiet dignity and keen intelligence in her face, and he had seen Karen Fletcher's sneering contempt. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine. Karen was a senior flight attendant protected by her union and a long, albeit checkered, service record. She was known among the ground staff as a bitter, difficult woman who felt the world owed her more than it had delivered. She treated junior staff with disdain and passengers with a thinly veiled impatience. But to openly mock the owner of the entire airline, that was an act of career suicide so spectacular, it was almost surreal. Robert knew he had a duty, not just to the company, but to the memory of Richard Reed. He couldn't let this stand. As soon as the flight was officially closed out, he walked to his supervisor's office. "I need to make a priority call to corporate headquarters," Robert said, his voice grim. "It's a code red situation." His supervisor, a younger man named Alex, looked up from his computer. Code red. "What happened? A security breach." "Worse," Robert said, leaning on the desk. "It's a culture breach, and it happened right in front of the one person who can burn this whole terminal to the ground with a single phone call." He explained what he had witnessed, the condescending laugh, the sarcastic whispers, the target of it all. As he spoke, the color drained from Alex's face. "Dr. Evelyn Reed." Alex whispered, his voice cracking, as in Richard Reed's daughter. "The new chairperson. She's on that flight in economy." Robert nodded gravely. "Seat 34B, and Karen Fletcher just treated her like dirt on her shoe." Alex scrambled for the phone, his hands trembling slightly. "Who do we call flight operations, the VP of in-flight services, all of them?" Robert said, his voice hard as steel. "And get me the direct line for Julian Croft's office." Julian Croft was the CEO, a man appointed by the board just before Richard Reed's final illness. He was a numbers man, an outsider who saw Stellaire as a collection of roots and assets. The CEO. Alex squeaked. "He needs to be on the tarmac when that plane lands at Heathrow." Robert stated his authority absolute in that moment. He needs to meet Ms. Reed personally. And he needs to understand that what happens next will define the future of this airline. Back on Flight 110. Now cruising at 35,000 feet over the Atlantic, the cabin lights were dimmed. Most passengers were settling in for the overnight journey, their faces bathed in the blue glow of their seatback screens. But Evelyn Reed wasn't watching a movie. She was watching her airline at work, and she was about to experience just how deep the rot went. The transatlantic crossing was a 6-hour bubble of suspended reality, a sealed tube of humanity hurtling through the dark. For most, it was a time for sleep, for movies, for disconnecting from the world below. For Evelyn, it was a live, uncontrolled experiment. Having established the baseline of disrespect at the gate, she was now observing how that attitude translated into the core function of the cabin crew in-flight service. The first test came with the beverage cart. It moved slowly down the aisle, a rumbling harbinger of lukewarm coffee and miniature cans of soda. Karen Fletcher was working Evelyn's side of the aisle, her movements efficient, but devoid of any warmth. Her smile was a painted-on grimace, a necessary part of the uniform, but as inauthentic as the plastic tray tables. When the cart reached Evelyn's row, Karen addressed the student by the window, then the sleeping man on the aisle. She seemed to make a point of looking over and through Evelyn, as if the middle seat were an empty void. "And for you?" she asked, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere above Evelyn's head. "Just some water, please." "No ice," Evelyn replied, her tone polite and unremarkable. Karen grabbed a plastic cup, filled it from a large bottle, and placed it on the tray of the man next to Evelyn. "There you are," she said, before starting to push the cart forward. "Excuse me," Evelyn said, not raising her voice. "I believe that was for me." Karen stopped, turning back with an exaggerated sigh. "Oh. Right." She picked up the cup and practically shoved it into Evelyn's hand, her fingers brushing against Evelyn's with a cold, dismissive touch. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of her error. It was a deliberate slight, a small act of power designed to reinforce Evelyn's perceived insignificance. Evelyn simply took the cup. "Thank you," she said, her composure unshaken. But in her mind, she noted the interaction. Incident 2: deliberate service neglect, undermining passenger request. An hour later, the dinner service began. The smell of reheated chicken and pasta filled the cabin. The options were, as expected, limited. When the cart arrived again, helmed by Karen and the junior flight attendant from the gate, Evelyn watched as the choice was offered to every passenger around her. "Chicken or pasta?" Karen asked the woman in the row ahead. "Chicken or pasta," she repeated to the man across the aisle. When she got to Evelyn's row, she didn't ask. She picked up a tray, the last chicken, and placed it on the student's table. She then grabbed a pasta tray and put it on Evelyn's table without a word. "Excuse me," Evelyn said calmly. "I would have preferred the chicken if it was available." Karen turned her face a mask of feigned surprise. "Oh, we're all out of the chicken. The pasta is very good." It was a blatant lie. Evelyn had seen her give the last one to the student without even asking his preference. It was another calculated move to assert dominance. "I see, Evelyn," said her voice betraying no emotion. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. She simply unwrapped the plastic cutlery. Protesting would have been the expected reaction of an aggrieved passenger. Her goal was not to win a small battle over a meal. It was to observe the entirety of the war being waged against her father's principles. She ate a few bites of the bland, overcooked pasta and then pushed the tray away. Incident 3. Withholding choice. Dishonesty in service delivery. Halfway through the flight, Evelyn decided to get up and stretch her legs near the rear galley. It was a small space, cluttered with service carts and canisters. Karen was there, leaning against a counter, talking to the purser, a man in his 40s named Michael Vance. He was her direct supervisor on this flight. Evelyn could hear their conversation as she approached. Can't believe the people we get in economy these days. Karen was saying, her voice dripping with venom. This one woman in my section calls herself Doctor. Doctor. On a 34B ticket. The audacity is just astounding. Michael chuckled a weak, placating sound. Well, you know how it is, Karen. Just smile and pour the coffee. We'll be in London soon enough. It's the principle of the thing Karen pressed on. They think they can just put on airs. I put her in her place, though. Laughed right at her ticket. You should have seen her face. Evelyn chose that moment to step into the galley to ask for another cup of water. Her presence sucked the air out of the small space. Michael Vance's eyes widened in panic as he recognized her from Karen's description. The junior flight attendant, who was also present, looked as if she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. Only Karen seemed unfazed. In fact, she seemed to relish the confrontation. She straightened up, a defiant smirk on her face. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone challenging. Evelyn ignored her, directing her question to the purser. "Mr. Vance, I'd just like a cup of water, please." Michael flustered, fumbled for a cup. "Of course, ma'am. Right away." "And I have to say," Evelyn continued, her voice still quiet, but now carrying an edge of cold authority that made Michael freeze. "I'm deeply concerned about the professional standards on this flight. The open mockery of passengers is not something I would ever expect from a Stellair crew." Karen stepped forward. "Now wait a minute. Are you making a complaint because I was just doing my job? If you're feeling sensitive, maybe you should have booked a more expensive ticket." This was the moment of truth for the purser. A direct complaint, a subordinate flagrantly disrespecting a passenger in front of him. This was his chance to de-escalate, to apologize, to assert his authority, and uphold the company's standards. He looked from Evelyn's implacable face to Karen's defiant sneer. He chose the path of least resistance. Now, let's all just calm down," Michael said, wringing his hands. "We're all a bit tired on these overnight flights. I'm sure there's just been a misunderstanding." He turned to Karen. "Karen, why don't you go check on the forward cabin?" He wasn't reprimanding her. He was protecting her. He was dismissing Evelyn's complaint as a mere misunderstanding. In that single cowardly act, he revealed the depth of the cultural rot. It wasn't just a single bad apple. The entire barrel was compromised. The leadership on board was either unable or unwilling to enforce the most basic standards of professional conduct. Evelyn looked at Michael, and for the first time, a flicker of her true disappointment showed in her eyes. She took the cup of water he offered. "There is no misunderstanding, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice soft but chilling. "There is only a profound lack of respect and a complete failure of leadership." She turned and walked back to her seat, leaving the 3 crew members in a stunned, uncomfortable silence. She sat down, took out her leather-bound notebook again, and under the dim cabin light, she wrote, "Incident 4. In-flight supervisor purser, Michael Vance, witnessed and failed to address unprofessional conduct and direct passenger complaint. Condoned insubordination. Systemic leadership failure confirmed." The rest of the flight passed in silence. Karen Fletcher avoided her aisle entirely, but the damage was done. The case against the current state of Stellair Airlines was building, and the verdict Evelyn knew would be delivered upon landing. As the Airbus A330 droned on through the pre-dawn sky, Evelyn Reed wasn't thinking about the bland pasta or the sarcastic jibes. She was thinking of her father, Richard. She could almost feel him in the seat beside her, his large, calloused hand patting her own, his deep voice rumbling with a mixture of pride and concern. Richard Reed was a titan of the industry, but he never acted like one. He was the son of a mechanic from Detroit, a man who had fallen in love with the magic of flight as a boy and had spent his life trying to share that magic with the world. He started Stellaire with a simple, revolutionary idea that air travel didn't have to be an ordeal. It could be an experience marked by dignity regardless of the price of your ticket. The logo on the tail doesn't fly the plane, Evie, he used to tell her, ruffling her hair. The people do. The ground crew, who guide it, in the mechanics, who keep it safe, the agents who check you in the crew, who serve you a coffee. They are the airline. If they lose their pride, the airline is just a hollow shell. For 30 years he was that ghost in the machine, a constant, unseen presence, ensuring the gears of his company meshed with humanity and respect. He would take random flights just like she was doing now, sitting in coach and talking to passengers and crew. He knew the names of their kids, the towns they were from. He built a culture of loyalty, not through bonuses, but through genuine connection. When he was forced to step back due to his illness, he entrusted the day-to-day operations to Julian Croft, a celebrated CEO from the tech industry, known for his ruthless efficiency and focus on shareholder value. The board had been thrilled. Croft's first moves were to streamline operations, renegotiate union contracts, and implement data-driven performance metrics. On paper, Stellaire had never been more profitable. The stock price soared. But Evelyn from the quiet world of her university office began to hear things. Old friends of her father, veteran employees who still felt a connection to the Reed family, would call her. They spoke of a new coldness in the corporate offices, of pressure to cut turnaround times, to upsell services, to treat passengers less like guests and more like self-loading cargo. They spoke of morale plummeting, of the pride her father had instilled being replaced by a cynical, resentful sense of just getting through the day. When she inherited her father's controlling stake, the board treated her as a figurehead, a psychologist, a woman, an academic. They presented her with glossy reports and assured her that the airline was stronger than ever. They smiled condescendingly when she asked questions about employee satisfaction and corporate culture, gently steering the conversation back to quarterly earnings and fleet acquisition strategies. They saw her as her father's sentimental daughter, not as his successor. That was their first mistake. Evelyn possessed her father's heart, but she had a will of forged steel and a mind trained to deconstruct complex systems, be they individual psyches or multinational corporations. She saw that the board, led by Croft, was harvesting the fruit of the tree her father had planted while poisoning its roots. They were cashing in on decades of goodwill, running the airline on the fumes of its old reputation. But fumes eventually run out. This trip was her answer to their glossy reports. It was her way of gathering her own data raw and unfiltered. Every sneer from Karen Fletcher, every cowardly hedge from Michael Vance was a data point that mattered more to her than any stock market fluctuation. They were symptoms of the disease she had come to diagnose. She thought about Karen. What made a person so bitter? Was she underpaid, overworked, passed over for promotions? Or was it something deeper, a curdled soul that took pleasure in wielding petty power over others? Evelyn's training as a psychologist urged her to understand the motivation, but her new role as chairperson demanded she address the behavior. Whatever Karen's reasons, her actions were a liability to the brand, a danger to the company's health. She was a virus, and the inaction of her superiors was the weakened immune system, allowing the infection to spread. The first hint of dawn was beginning to streak the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of lavender and orange. The cabin began to stir. The flight was nearing its end, but Evelyn's work was just beginning. She knew what she had to do. Firing Karen Fletcher would be easy. It would be a simple, satisfying act of justice. But it wouldn't solve the problem. Firing one person would be like treating a single symptom while ignoring the cancer that produced it. The failure wasn't just Karen's. It was Michael Vance's for his weakness. It was his superiors for promoting a culture where that weakness was acceptable. And ultimately, it was Julian Croft's and the board's for valuing profit margins over the human principles that were the company's true foundation. A full cultural overhaul was needed. A rededication to the Reed principles. It would be a monumental task, a battle against entrenched corporate inertia and the apostles of the bottom line. The board would fight her. Croft would try to manage her. They would see her as a naive idealist. That was their second mistake. As the plane began its final descent into London, banking over the sleeping city, Evelyn felt a calm resolve settle over her. She wasn't just her father's heir. She was his legacy, and she would not allow it to be dismantled and sold for parts. The flight was ending, but she was just getting started. The people on this plane and in her company had no idea who Dr. Evelyn Reed truly was. But they were all about to find out. The touchdown at Heathrow was smooth, a testament to the skill of the pilots, who, unseen and unheard, had flawlessly performed their primary duty. As the plane taxied towards the terminal, the familiar ritual of arrival began. The chime of unbuckled seatbelts, the rustle of passengers gathering their belongings, the collective sigh of a journey completed. Karen Fletcher and Michael Vance stood near the cockpit door, their faces set in the practiced farewell smiles they had displayed thousands of times before. Karen's eyes scanned the deplaning passengers, a flicker of her earlier arrogance returning now that she was back on solid ground. She spotted Evelyn approaching, and her smile tightened a glint of defiance in her eyes. She was ready for a snide parting shot. But as Evelyn stepped into the doorway, the scene on the jet bridge was not what anyone expected. It wasn't the usual queue of weary travelers. Standing just outside the aircraft door were three figures who immediately commanded attention. One was Julian Croft, the CEO of Stellair Airlines, his handsome, silver-haired visage a mask of extreme anxiety. His bespoke suit was immaculate, but a fine sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead, despite the cool morning air. Beside him stood the Heathrow station manager, a woman whose face was pale with apprehension. And standing slightly in front of them both, his expression a thunderous mixture of fury and grim validation, was Robert Peterson, the gate agent from JFK. The airline had flown him across the Atlantic on the next available flight, a Concorde-era supersonic jet. They kept for emergencies, a fact that underscored the gravity of the situation. He had landed a full 2 hours before Flight 110, time he had used to brief a horrified Julian Croft on exactly what had transpired. The deplaning passengers slowed, sensing the tension. Karen Fletcher's defiant smirk faltered, replaced by a look of utter confusion. Why was the CEO on the jet bridge? And why was that old gate agent from New York standing with him, looking at her as if she were a condemned criminal? Julian Croft ignored Karen completely. His eyes were locked on Evelyn. He stepped forward, his movements stiff. "Dr. Reed," he began, his voice strained. "On behalf of the entire company, I want to offer my most sincere, profound apologies for any part of your travel experience that was less than satisfactory." Evelyn simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. She then shifted her gaze to Robert Peterson, and gave him a small, appreciative nod. Robert. Thank you for being here. Robert's expression softened slightly. It was my duty, Ms. Reed. To you, and to your father. The use of Ms. Reed and the CEO's groveling apology sent a shockwave through the assembled crew. Michael Vance looked as if he was about to faint. The junior flight attendant's eyes were wide with dawning horror. But it was Karen who finally spoke, her voice a reedy, confused squawk. Ms. Reed. What is going on? Who is she? Julian Croft turned to her, and for the first time, Karen saw the full, unadulterated fury of a CEO whose multi-million-dollar career was flashing before his eyes. Who is she? Croft repeated, his voice dangerously low. This is Dr. Evelyn Reed. She is not just a passenger, you imbecile. She is the chairperson of the board and our majority shareholder. This isn't just her flight you were on. You were in her house. You are standing on her airplane. She owns this entire airline. The silence on the jet bridge was absolute. The only sound was the distant whine of a turbine engine. Karen Fletcher's face went through a rapid, devastating transformation. The confusion morphed into disbelief, then into a sickening, dawning comprehension, and finally into sheer, unadulterated terror. The blood drained from her face, leaving her skin a pasty, translucent white. Her mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. The doctor of basket weaving. The woman she had laughed at, mocked, and deliberately mistreated for 6 straight hours was the single most powerful person in the entire global corporation. Her world, built on a foundation of petty grievances and misplaced superiority, had just been leveled. The ground hadn't just shifted beneath her feet, it had vanished entirely. I didn't know, she stammered, her voice a pathetic whisper. It was the desperate, reflexive excuse of the court. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice cutting through the tension with the precision of a scalpel. She addressed not Karen, but the Heathrow station manager. Please escort Ms. Fletcher and Mr. Vance to a secure office, she commanded. Their crew credentials are to be suspended effective immediately. They are not to operate any Stellair aircraft or enter any secure Stellair facilities until further notice. Have airport security meet them. They are grounded. The word grounded hung in the air, a pilot's worst nightmare, now applied to the cabin crew. It was a sentence of professional death. Security officers who had been waiting discreetly at the end of the jet bridge stepped forward. Karen began to hyperventilate, her carefully constructed composure shattering into a million pieces. No, please. It was a mistake, a misunderstanding. She pleaded, her eyes darting wildly between Evelyn and Julian Croft. I've been with this airline for 20 years. 20 years. Evelyn met her gaze, her own eyes filled not with anger or triumph, but with a profound and weary disappointment. 20 years is long enough to learn how to treat another human being with basic dignity. Ms. Fletcher. Evelyn said, her voice devoid of any emotion. A lesson you have clearly failed to learn. Your tenure did not give you the right to disrespect our customers. It gave you the responsibility to set an example. And in that, you have failed catastrophically. As the security officers gently but firmly led a now sobbing Karen Fletcher and a ghostly pale Michael Vance away, Evelyn turned her attention back to the CEO. Julian, she said, her voice now crisp and businesslike. My car is waiting. We will go directly to the London office. You will assemble your executive team via video conference. I want the head of in-flight services, the head of human resources, and the head of corporate culture on that call. "We have a great deal to discuss." "Of course, Dr. Reed." "Absolutely," Croft stammered, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. Evelyn started to walk down the jet bridge, her simple loafers making almost no sound on the floor. She paused beside Robert Peterson. "Robert," she said, placing a hand on his arm, "I will not forget this. You acted with the integrity my father always valued. You are what this airline is supposed to be." Tears welled in the old gate agent's eyes. "I just did what Mr. Reed would have expected, Ma'am." "I know," Evelyn said, softly. "And that is why things are going to change." She walked away, leaving the CEO scrambling to follow in her wake. The quiet passenger from seat 34B had deplaned. The chairperson of Stellair Airlines had arrived, and the reckoning was just beginning. The Stellair corporate office in London was a shrine to modern impersonal design. Glass walls brushed steel accents and abstract art that cost more than a pilot's annual salary. It was a space designed by Julian Croft to project an image of sleek, forward-thinking profitability. To Evelyn, it felt sterile and soulless, a perfect reflection of the culture he had fostered. Within an hour of their arrival, the emergency executive meeting was underway. Julian Croft sat at the head of the long, polished mahogany table. Evelyn chose a seat not at the opposite end, but to his immediate right, a physical statement of proximity and power. On a massive screen that dominated one wall, the faces of a half-dozen vice presidents from New York blinked into view. Their expressions a mixture of confusion and panic, having been roused from their beds in the middle of the night. Evelyn let Julian begin. He recounted the events of Flight 110 in a carefully sanitized corporate speak version, referring to a serious customer service failure involving a high-value stakeholder. Evelyn cut him off mid-sentence. "Let's dispense with the euphemisms, Julian," she said, her voice silencing the room. This was not a service failure. This was a symptom of a terminal illness within our corporate culture, an illness of arrogance, disrespect, and contempt for the very people who pay our salaries. She then proceeded with the calm, methodical precision of an academic presenting a thesis to detail every single event she had witnessed. She spoke of Karen Fletcher's initial laugh at the gate. She described the deliberate service slights with the water and the meal. She recounted verbatim the conversation she overheard in the galley between Karen and Michael Vance. And she detailed Vance's complete failure to perform his duties as a supervisor. One employee, Ms. Fletcher, was actively hostile. Evelyn stated her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces on the screen and in the room. But the true failure belongs to her supervisor, Mr. Vance, who witnessed this behavior and condoned it. It belongs to his manager, who fostered an environment where a purser felt it was safer to appease a toxic employee than to defend a customer. And it belongs to every single person in this room who has prioritized abstract metrics over the human experience in our cabins. The head of in-flight services. A man named George began to stammer an excuse. "Dr. Reed, I assure you this is an isolated incident. Karen Fletcher has had some complaints in the past. But her seniority is irrelevant." Evelyn interjected her voice like ice. "Does her seniority give her a license to engage in racist microaggressions? Does it allow her to mock a passenger's title? Does it permit her to lie about service availability? None. Her seniority means she is one of our most experienced representatives. She should have been a role model. Instead, she was a cancer. And you, George, knew she had prior complaints, and you did nothing. You are part of the disease." A heavy silence fell over the room. Evelyn's words were not just an indictment of 2 crew members. They were a direct assault on the entire leadership structure. "So here is what is going to happen," she continued, her tone shifting from diagnostic to prescriptive. "Effective immediately. Karen Fletcher's and Michael Vance's employment with Stellar Airlines is terminated. There will be no severance package. Their records will state termination for gross misconduct, including discriminatory behavior and dereliction of duty. I want a full review of every complaint ever filed against Ms. Fletcher, and an investigation into why they were not acted upon sooner. George, you will personally oversee this review, and your own future at this company will depend on its thoroughness." She then turned her attention to the head of human resources. "We are scrapping our current customer service training module. It is clearly ineffective. It will be replaced by a new program, developed in consultation with my office. It will be called the Richard Reed Standard of Dignity. It will focus on empathy de-escalation and the core principle that every single person who steps onto our aircraft is to be treated as an honored guest. Every single one of our 20,000 cabin crew members, from the newest hire to the most senior purser, will be required to pass this new certification within the next 6 months. Anyone who fails will be retrained. If they fail a second time, they will be offered a role on the ground. They will not fly again." The collective intake of breath in the room was audible. This was not a minor course correction. This was a revolution. Furthermore, Evelyn pressed on. "We are instituting a ground truth program. Once a quarter, every executive from the vice president level up to the CEO will be required to fly at least 2 long-haul segments. They will fly in economy. They will not identify themselves to the crew. They will submit a detailed report of their experience directly to my office. We will no longer manage this airline from 30,000 feet in theory. We will do it from seat 34B in practice." Her eyes finally settled on Julian Croft, who sat frozen, his face ashen. "And Julian," she said, her voice softening, almost imperceptibly, but losing none of its steel. "My father entrusted you with his company. He believed your business acumen would make it stronger. But you have confused a strong stock price with a strong company. A company's true strength is in its people and its reputation. You have allowed both to wither. You have 1 year to turn this culture around. You will implement these changes, you will champion them, and you will make the Richard Reed Standard the beating heart of this airline once more. If you cannot or will not, I will find someone who can." It was not a threat. It was a promise. The meeting concluded in a state of shell shock. The executives who had seen Evelyn Reed as a quiet academic figurehead now saw her for what she was, a formidable leader with a clear vision and an unbreakable will. The ghost of Richard Reed was no longer just a memory. It was a living, breathing force, and it was taking back control of the airline he had built. The karma for Karen Fletcher was swift and hard. Fired and disgraced, she found herself blacklisted in the industry. The story of her spectacular self-destruction became a cautionary tale whispered in crew lounges around the world. For Michael Vance, the consequence was a quiet, ignominious end to a career he had built on mediocrity and conflict avoidance. But the true karmic justice was not in their punishment. It was in the systemic cleansing their actions had triggered. Their moment of ugly prejudice had inadvertently become the catalyst for a cultural rebirth, ensuring that thousands of their colleagues would now be held to a higher, more dignified standard. The laughter had been silenced, replaced by the humming of a vast corporate machine being retuned to the frequency of respect. 6 months later, the changes at Stellaire Airlines were no longer just memos and directives. They were a tangible reality. The Richard Reed standard of dignity was in full swing. The training sessions, designed with Evelyn's direct input, were intense, immersive experiences. They used role-playing psychological case studies and emotional intelligence coaching to reinstill the values of empathy and respect into the cabin crew. The program was led by a surprising new hire as its director, Robert Peterson. Evelyn had personally promoted him from his gate agent position in New York, recognizing that his innate integrity and decades of on-the-ground experience were more valuable than any corporate resume. He commanded immediate respect from the crews, who saw him not as a corporate suit, but as one of their own, who embodied the best of the airline's forgotten ideals. The Ground Truth program sent shockwaves through the executive ranks. The sight of the VP of Marketing wedged in a middle seat on a red-eye to San Francisco, or the chief financial officer waiting in line for the lavatory, became a powerful equalizer. Their reports, filled with first-hand accounts of everything from lumpy seats to exemplary service, gave Evelyn the unvarnished data she needed. It forced the leadership to confront the real-world consequences of their boardroom decisions. Julian Croft, to his credit, rose to the challenge. Faced with the clear directive from his formidable new boss, he transformed from a detached numbers man into a reluctant then genuine champion of the new culture. He realized that Evelyn was right. A happy crew and respected passengers led to repeat business and a stronger brand, which in turn led to healthier profits. It was a language he understood, simply reframed in a more human dialect. Today, Evelyn Reed was at the Stellaire training facility near Washington Dulles, an unobtrusive observer at the back of an auditorium. She was dressed in her usual understated style, watching the graduation ceremony for the first wave of flight attendants to complete the new certification. Robert Peterson was on stage. His voice, once used to announce boarding zones, now filled with a powerful paternal pride. "Your uniform doesn't just represent an airline," Robert told the sea of new and veteran faces. "It represents a promise that for the time a passenger is in our care, they will be treated with safety, with professionalism, and with a dignity that every human being deserves. Never forget that you may be the first Stellaire employee someone meets on the best day of their life, a honeymoon, a new job, or on the worst day of their life, a funeral, a family emergency. You have the power in that small moment to be a point of light. That is the Richard Reed standard. That is the Stellaire promise." After the ceremony, as the newly recertified crew mingled, a young flight attendant approached Evelyn, her face bright with enthusiasm. "Ma'am," she began, not knowing exactly who Evelyn was, but sensing her importance. "I just wanted to say thank you. I'm a new hire, and I was so scared after hearing some of the stories about how things used to be. But this training, it makes me feel proud to wear this uniform." Evelyn smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. "It's you who should be proud. You are the future of this airline. Never lose that feeling." As the young woman walked away, Evelyn felt a sense of profound satisfaction. This was the real victory, not the firing of a bitter employee, but the creation of 1,000 new ambassadors of respect. Her father's airline was not just a hollow shell anymore. She could feel its heart beginning to beat strong again. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Julian Croft. "Q2 customer satisfaction scores are in. Highest in a decade. Congratulations, Madam Chair." Evelyn put the phone back in her pocket, her gaze drifting out the window to the airfield, where a Stellaire jet was gracefully taking off, climbing into the vast blue sky. It was on a new flight path now, one guided not just by instruments and flight plans, but by a renewed sense of purpose. The laughter of one had been replaced by the pride of many. The legacy was safe. The story of Dr. Evelyn Reed and Stellaire Airlines is a powerful reminder that true authority isn't always announced with fanfare. Sometimes it sits quietly in seat 34B, observing and taking notes. It's a testament to the fact that one person's prejudice, no matter how small it seems, can have catastrophic consequences when it confronts a hidden giant. But more importantly, it shows that the hard hand of karma doesn't have to be just about punishment. In this case, it was about purification. The disrespect shown by one employee became the catalyst that saved the soul of an entire company, forcing it to rebuild itself on a foundation of dignity. It reminds us all to treat every single person we meet with respect, because we never truly know the world they command or the legacy they carry. If this story of righteous justice and transformative change resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more true stories where karma isn't just a concept, it's a final destination.